Hi guys, let's read the social issues section of the June 2020 Vision IAS Current Affairs. So the first topic is urban poor. So why was this in the news? The disproportionate impact of COVID-19 pandemic on urban informal workers, including their migration from cities to their native places, brought into focus the issues of urban poor. Introduction. India's urban population has grown rapidly over the last century from 25 million in 1901 to 377 million in 2011, which constitute 31.2% of the total population in the country. But the urban areas have failed to meet the demands of increasing population pressure, resulting in large gaps in provisioning of basic amenities of housing, drinking water, sewerage, transportation, etc. Now let's come to a table here. Poverty line in India per capita per month at 2011-12 prices. All data from 2011-12. So we're going to compare to a Committee on Poverty Estimation. The first one is Tendulkar Committee and the next is Rangarajan Committee. So rural poverty line for Tendulkar is rupees 816. For Rangarajan is rupees 972. Urban poverty line for Tendulkar is rupees 1000 and for Rangarajan is rupees 1407. For rural poverty level, Tendulkar 25.4%, Rangarajan 30.9%. For urban poverty level, Tendulkar 13.7%, Rangarajan 26.4%. All India poverty level, Tendulkar 21.9% and Rangarajan 29.5%. Now let's come to issues of urban poverty. Urban poverty being multi-dimensional. So urban poverty being multi-dimensional, various vulnerabilities are faced by the poor in cities and towns. As identified by 10th Five-Year Plan, there are several types of vulnerabilities broadly classified as: the first one is housing vulnerability. The second is economic vulnerability. The third is social vulnerability. And the fourth is personal vulnerability. So now let's come to the first one, that is housing vulnerability. Majority of urban poor generally live in low quality unhygienic areas such as slums. They have no ownership rights and entitlements. As occupants construct on the empty land, the civic body does not provide them basic amenities. Therefore, they have no access to individual water connections, toilets, electricity, and roads. Also, poor live in unhealthy and unsanitary living conditions. According to Census 2011, 17.7% of urban population, comprising 65 million people, lives in slums. Now let's come to economic vulnerability. Irregular employment with low wages makes them more vulnerable. This restricts availability of formal credit from banks. They have no access to formal safety net programs and productive assets. Now let's come to social vulnerability. The income inequality creates divergence between lower strata of society, that is poor and middle class. It increases social differences in education and skill development programs. Now let's come to personal vulnerability. At personal level, poor are more vulnerable for getting social justice in their day-to-day work. The poor are victims of all types of injustice and violence, particularly low-caste people and minorities, especially women, children, the elderly, disabled, and destitute, have no access to social justice. Now let's come to the challenges for urban poor due to COVID-19 pandemic. Increasing risk. There are several factors that put the urban poor, especially those living in slums, at high risk for contracting infectious diseases such as COVID-19. These risks are linked to overcrowded living conditions, crowded transport services, specific aspects of working in the informal sector, often in crowded places, no social protection to fall back on, etc. The next challenge is job losses. In the current coronavirus crisis and the lockdown, most migrants in cities find themselves suddenly jobless as factories close, supply chains shut down, and services freeze. The third challenge would be limited alternatives. A major cause of concern is the state of migrant workers, especially seasonal migrants, those who move between rural and urban India based on agricultural seasons. Since the lockdown, many of these workers have returned home, but the rural economy is not capable of absorbing such a large number of workers, even with the MG Narega. Public transfers and other assistance. Ensuring that food items and essential supplies such as medicines reach the vulnerable sections has been a challenge in this period. The government has responded to the crisis by announcing several social protection schemes, including direct benefit transfers for certain sections of the population and free LPG refills, grains, and pulses for the poor. But large sections of the urban population, including urban informal workers, remain out of scope of government benefits for the want of documents. Lack of social protection for urban poor. Nearly 70% of social protection beneficiaries are in rural India. But there's a growing urban economy and also fair amount of mobility between rural to urban India. The needs of a more mobile and urban India have not been addressed. For example, for COVID crisis, the government was able to quickly use pre-existing schemes like PM Kisan, available only in rural India. There is no urban equivalent of a MN Narega or PM Kisan. Government interventions for urban poor. The Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation MOHUPA is the nodal agency at the center responsible for development of urban poor. So the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation MOHUPA is the nodal agency at the center responsible for development of urban poor. There are various schemes which address various vulnerabilities of the urban poor. To address housing vulnerability, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana urban program launched by the MOHUPA in mission mode envisions provision of housing for all by 2022. The mission seeks to address the housing requirement of urban poor, including slum dwellers. Also recently, government approved a scheme named Developing of Affordable Rental Housing Complexes ARHCS for urban migrants or poor. To address economic vulnerability, MOHUPA is implementing a centrally sponsored scheme, Deen Dayal Antyodaya Yojana, National Urban Livelihoods Mission, DAY-NULM, for reducing the poverty and vulnerability of urban poor households. Vulnerability of urban poor households since 2013. The mission covers all the statutory towns to be decided by the state as per local need and capability. Also, the Street Vendors Protection of Livelihood and Regulation of Street Vending Act 2014 aims to protect the rights of urban street vendors and to regulate street vending activities. So far, 33 states or union territories have notified the scheme. Meghalaya has its own Street Vendors Act. To address social vulnerability, Pradhan Mantri Jeevan Jyoti Bima Yojana PMJJBY, Pradhan Mantri Suraksha Bima Yojana PMSBY, and Atal Pension Yojana APY seek to bring unorganized sector workers and poor across the country, including rural areas, under the safety net of insurance and pension. More recently, Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Man Dhan PMSYM, a pension scheme for unorganized workers, was launched. So, more recently, Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Man Dhan PMSYM, a pension scheme for unorganized workers, was launched. How to tackle the causes of urban poverty? COVID 19 has forced us to look at imbalanced growth planning of cities and an impoverished urban population. In such a scenario, following suggestions could be implemented to tackle the persisting challenges. Reform the urban governance. Rebuilding urban governance model on the following pillars: convergence and accountability, urban populace specific schemes, wider public participation and use of the latest technologies. Build a credible database of the urban poor and migrants, along with mapping their skills, that is maintained centrally at the district level. The National Migrant Database, announced by the National Disaster Management Authority, is a step in this direction. This data shall also assist policymakers in developing tailor-made schemes for the urban populace. Decentralized urban growth. Urban planning should be decentralized by focusing on smaller cities and towns. This will lessen the burden of migrant population onto megacities and also enhance the livability within the city. Strengthening of ULBs. Change statutes to allow municipal corporations to plan for the entire city even if the development of certain areas fall under parastatals. So, change statutes to allow municipal corporations to plan for the entire city, even if the developments of certain areas fall under parastatals. Enhance municipal budgets, and like South Africa and Brazil, bring in equalization grants, which municipal corporations can access for any development works that they wish to carry out. Improving life in rural areas. In order to control large scale migrations from rural to urban areas, the current state of rural infrastructure or lack thereof must be addressed. Address health and social vulnerability. Learning from COVID pandemic should be incorporated to focus on social determinants of healthcare by creating a robust, equitable, and sustainable infrastructure that should be inclusive for all levels of society and ensure strong grassroots level partnership with communities. Now let's come to progress on Urban Employment Guarantee Program. Pradhan Mantri recently announced a 100-day urban job guarantee scheme, the Yuva Swabhiman Yojana, which provides urban youth with varying educational qualifications with wide set of jobs. Since 2010, Kerala has been running Ayankali Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme, which guarantees 100 days of manual work wage employment to an urban household. Orissa recently launched an urban wage employment initiative for urban informal labor to carry out public works identified by ULBs. Himachal Pradesh has announced the Mukhya Mantri uh, Shahri Ajivika Guarantee Yojana, which assures urban poor 120 days work. Himachal Pradesh has announced the Mukhyamantri Shahri Ajivika Guarantee Yojana, which assures urban poor 120 days work. Jharkhand has proposed Mukhyamantri Shramik Yojana, under which urban workers will be able to demand a maximum 100 days of work. Demand for National Urban Employment Guarantee Program UEGP. Low budgetary provisions, poor human resource, and less empowered urban local bodies create challenges in assuring a better living environment and a right to decent livelihood for every urban poor. Also, the COVID-19 led to widespread job losses in urban areas. In this backdrop, there is a demand for National Urban Employment Guarantee Program UEGP. What are the benefits of UEGP? A UEGP would help to address the underemployment and low wages in the informal urban workforce by mandating a regulatory wage like MG Narega. It will also help to retain the local workforce in smaller cities and towns by providing work on demand, thus tackling the challenge of migration to large cities. There is also a crisis of the quality of life due to economical stress and lack of adequate public services. A centrally funded program covering the wages of different kinds of workers will allow the ULBs to fulfill tasks they are mandated to perform. Further, a UEGP can generate a new set of green jobs that can strengthen the capacity of ULBs as well as promote sustainable urban development. Thus, a well planned UEGP not only directly improves welfare by raising incomes and creating assets, there are many positive spillover effects too, such as it increases demand by raising incomes directly and indirectly in the informal sector by improving the fallback positive alternatives of workers. It provides a better trained workforce to the private sector by allowing educated young workers to acquire skills and improve their employability. The work undertaken will create assets that improve the town's ecology and quality of public services. It creates a shared sense of public goods in which every resident has a stake. Further, an employment guarantee program also also strengthens the right to life enshrined under Article 21. Now let's come to the challenges. Rural Guarantee Scheme (MG Narega) works on self-selection. All of the work under the scheme is of unskilled manual nature. Whether such a framework be implemented in the urban economy remains a moot question. The basic premise of a healthy rural to urban economic transformation is to transfer workers from low skill and low productivity professions to high skill jobs. It would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for an urban employment guarantee scheme to ensure this. Given the fact that common land, which is where most of the rural guarantee works happen, is scarcer in cities than in villages, even an unskilled job guarantee might be difficult to implement in cities. Now let's come to the second topic, that is drug abuse in India. Why was this in the news? World Drug Report 2020 was released by the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime (UNODC) that has outlined the possible consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on illegal drug production, supply and consumption. In India, Nasha Mukt Bharat Annual Action Plan 2020-21 for 272 most affected districts was launched by Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment on the occasion of International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking, June 26. So what is drug abuse? Drug abuse or substance abuse refers to the use of certain chemicals for the purpose of creating pleasurable effects on the brain. Substances of abuse include alcohol, opiates, cocaine, amphetamines, hallucinogens, prescription, and over-the-counter drug abuse. World Drug Report 2020. Key findings. Drug use has been on the rise, both overall numbers and the proportion of the world's population. Over 35 million people suffer from drug use disorder. Over 5.5 lakh deaths were attributed to drug use in 2017. Transition to drug use disorders is more prevalent among people with a lower socioeconomic status. Over the past 2 decades, drug use increased far more rapidly in developing countries than in developed countries, though it is more widespread in developed countries. Drug use is higher in urban areas than in rural areas in both developed and developing countries. Cannabis was the most used substance worldwide in 2018, while opioids remain the most harmful. Drug market is becoming more complex. Plant-based substances such as cannabis, cocaine, and heroin have been joined by hundreds of synthetic drugs, many not under international control. There has also been a rapid rise in the non-medical use of pharmaceutical drugs. What are the impact of COVID-19 pandemic? Rise in drug use and drug trafficking. Pandemic are likely to disproportionately affect the poorest, making them more vulnerable to drug use and also to drug trafficking and cultivation in order to earn money. Increased risk for drug users among COVID-19 patients as they now have compromised immune systems. Alternative trafficking routes due to restrictions to tackle the pandemic along the existing trafficking routes. For example, a recent uptick in opiate Seizures in the Indian Ocean indicate that traffickers are increasingly looking to maritime routes. Reduced access to drug disorder treatment due to lockdown measures. Now let's come to drug abuse in India. As per the UNODC 2020 report, India is also among the countries with highest illicit cultivation and production of cannabis from 2010 to 2017. In 2018, India topped with largest seizure in South Asia amounting to 266.5 tons of cannabis herb. As per the report submitted by AIMS in 2019, alcohol is the most common psychoactive substance used by Indians, followed by cannabis and opioids. Within India, the worst affected regions are Northeast India, especially Manipur, and Northwest India, especially Punjab, followed by Mumbai and Delhi, and now Haryana. Causes of drug abuse. Geographical location. India is the link country between the two major opium producing regions of the world, namely the Golden Triangle and the Golden Crescent. Also, the coastal states are susceptible to maritime drug trafficking due to their exposure to trafficking routes across the Indian Ocean. BIMSTEC region, due to its close proximity to China, leading country in the pharma sector, is very vulnerable to the diversion and trafficking in pharmaceutical drugs. Socio-economic factors. Family history of addiction, unemployment, changing cultural values, and dwindling supportive bonds. Peer pressure, glorification by media. Biological factors, pre-existing psychiatric or personality disorder or a medical disorder. Psychological factors, low self-esteem, poor stress management, social rebelliousness, childhood loss or trauma. Weak law enforcement and regulatory controls. Implementation of laws such as Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985 by the states has been tardy. Developments in technology such as use of darknet for drug trafficking and inadequately trained staff. Many times illicitly produced opium for pharmaceutical sector is diverted to illicit channels in India. Now we have the Golden Crescent and Golden Triangle. Golden Crescent includes Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we have India in the middle. Then we have Golden Triangle, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam and Thailand. Now let's come to the impacts of drug abuse. Threat to demographic dividend. With most drug users being in the productive age group of 18 to 35 years, the loss in terms of human potential is incalculable. Impact on family. The drug abuse problems may affect interpersonal relationships, instability in family, child abuse, economic insecurity, deprivation of schooling, etc. Strong link between injecting drug use IDU and the spread of HIV or AIDS. Illegal nature of drug trafficking makes it prone to money laundering and terror financing. Now let's come to legal framework and steps taken by government to deal with drug menace. Article 47 of the Constitution provides that the state shall endeavor to bring about prohibition of the consumption, except for medical purposes, of intoxicating drinks and of drugs which are injurious to health. Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances (NDPS) Act in the year 1985 was enacted for the control and regulation of operations relating to narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. Under it, the Narcotics Control Bureau (NCB) was constituted as the nodal drug law enforcement and intelligence agency of India, responsible for fighting drug trafficking and the abuse of illegal substances. Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment has prepared a National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction (NAPDDR) for 2018-2025. The plan aims at reduction. So the plan aims at reduction of drug abuse through a multi-pronged strategy involving education, de-addiction, and rehabilitation of affected individuals and their families. Recently, Ministry launched Nasha Mukt Bharat Annual Action Plan 2020-2021 for 272 most affected districts. It aims to reach out to children and youth for awareness about ill effect of drug use, increase community participation and public cooperation, supporting government hospitals for opening up de-addiction centers in addition to existing ministry supported de-addiction centers IRCAs and conducting training program for participants. Now let's come to international collaboration. India is a signatory to the 3 UN conventions, namely Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs 1961, Convention on Psychotropic Substances 1971, and Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances 1988. India launched BIMSTEC Conference on Combating Drug Trafficking, an important platform for the partner nations to share ideas and exchange best practices required to combat the drug menace in the region. Now let's come to theory of change in alternative development. So here's a figure showing the vicious circle. Rising illicit drug production, weakening of the rule of law, reduction in overall growth of the illicit economy, reduction in investment into illicit sectors, strengthening of organized crime and increasing violence. Then it leads to rising illicit drug production. Alternative development. It would be falling illicit drug production, weakening of organized crime and falling violence, increase in investment into illicit sectors, increase in overall growth of the illicit economy, falling poverty and strengthening of the rule of law, then falling illicit drug production. So this is another virtuous cycle. So the first one is the vicious circle and this is the virtuous circle. Substance use prevention programs. So let's come to the way forward. Substance use prevention programs aimed at not just preventing substance use but also ensuring that young people grow and stay healthy into adulthood, enabling them to realize their potential and become productive members of their community and society. Conducive legal and policy environment. Training and capacity building for healthcare professionals, increasing the range and number of healthcare providers who are allowed to prescribe and dispense controlled substances and improving national supply management systems. Stigma associated with drug use and drug use disorders needs to be addressed by promoting the understanding that initiation of drug use and the development of drug use disorders are influenced by factors that are often beyond the control of an individual. Efficient coordination between the drug supply control sector as well as the entities involved in drug demand reduction and harm reduction. Enhancing collaboration between governments, United Nations entities, non governmental organizations, and academia. Alternative development programs to address the current and potential ability of such farmers to manage risk and shocks. Example through income diversification, access to credit, savings, and social protection can help them move away from cultivating illicit crops. Now let's come to the third topic, that is gender dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic. So why was this in the news? COVID-19 lockdown and social distancing norms are likely to have an outsized impact on women. Introduction. The COVID-19 outbreak is impacting societies around the world in an unprecedented manner. However, not everyone in every place will be affected in the same way. Experiences from previous pandemics show that women can be especially active actors for change while they can also experience the effects of the crisis in different and often more negative ways. Gender gaps in outcomes across endowments, health and education, agency and economic opportunity persist across countries. Impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will be amplified by those pre-existing gender differences. For the most part, the negative impacts can be expected to exacerbate, that is, the more individuals are affected, and deepen, that is, the conditions or disadvantages of some individuals worsen. India's women's vulnerability to COVID-19's impacts. The first one is childhood and job security. Oxfam India estimates the economic loss from women losing their jobs during the pandemic at about $216 billion, around 8% of the GDP. This clouds women's already poor economic outlook. According to the ILO, 81% of Indian women work in the informal economy. The informal sector is the worst hit by the coronavirus imposed economic slowdown. The economic cost of the lockdown may be disproportionately borne by women in the end. The need for social distancing has also temporarily disrupted the functioning of self-help groups that have been credited with improving women's well-being and empowerment. Feminization of poverty. Many women are at risk of a permanent exit from the labor market. The end result will be the feminization of income poverty. Research from the World Bank suggests the pandemic will drive more than 12 million Indians into poverty. Women are likely to be overrepresented among the new poor. Social inequalities. The impact of the virus is also exacerbating India's deep-rooted social inequalities and unsafe environment in many places, and the burden of domestic responsibilities have kept many women away from work. Domestic violence. There has been a more than twofold rise in complaints of domestic violence since the lockdown. The UNFPA warns that the pandemic could reduce world progress against gender based violence by one third. Migrant women. Many of the millions of migrant workers forced to flee cities for their rural homes with little notice were women. They have safety concerns with travel, a risk for many. COVID 19 is shifting other household dynamics too. Domestic responsibilities that women bear, like cooking and cleaning, have escalated. As women in Indian families tend to eat last and least, financial strain and food shortages affect women's nutrition more than men. Gender inequality in food security will increase further following the loss of employment income. Now let's come to health. Women may face specific constraints to access health services. According to government data, 55% of women report not using public health services. Out of pocket health expenditures are higher for women than for men in most developing countries. Key services such as maternal health, vaccination, sexual and reproductive health, etc., get interrupted during public health emergencies with negative consequences for women. Exposure to infection through work and care. In India, women are at higher risk of contracting the virus because they are overrepresented in the healthcare sector, including as part of the frontline health staff, example nurses, community health workers, birth attendants. Nutrition. With the schools shut down, children's education is likely to suffer along with an increase in malnourishment due to disruption of midday meal. The situation will worsen for girls as they are more dependent on the midday meal programs given the gendered nature of nutrition provision in households with limited resources. Other aspects. The additional burden of care. One of the primary reasons that women leave the workforce or do not enter it in the first place is their unpaid caregiving responsibilities at home. Long standing patriarchal society norms and cultural expectations have put the burden of caring for children, the elderly, and the household on Indian women. Social distancing and digital education. Girls' education will be disadvantaged as only 29% of internet users in India are female, and there's a tendency for families with limited means to give preference to boys for schooling. Policy response. Way forward. The pandemic calls for greater consultations between the Ministry of Finance and the Women and Child Ministry to understand the differential impacts of COVID 19 on women and effective policy measures to address them. Some immediate steps that the government may adopt include the first step is support to women facing domestic violence. To help women file complaint and seek help. The National Commission for Women has launched an emergency WhatsApp number in addition to online complaint links and emails. But governments must ensure adequate facilities and social distancing in shelter homes to ensure that women are able to file complaints against abusers fearlessly. Extend MGNREGS to urban areas to help the urban poor. Given the large scale unemployment in urban areas and the hardships of the large number of migrant workers who are still in urban centers, MG Naregas should be extended to the urban areas to create jobs for the urban poor. This will be especially beneficial for a large number of women, particularly domestic workers, who will fail to find employment as middle class women stay at home and focus on the unpaid care work. Expand the ambit of Mgnaregas to include handicrafts or folk arts. Women play an important role in preserving handicrafts and art but have been completely left out of the relief package. Without government support, these crafts may be lost forever. For instance, an artisan can teach her skill to children under Mgnarega. Including crafts and folk arts under Mgnarega will achieve the twin objectives of providing income support to poor women and preserving Indian handicrafts and arts. Support for women's self-help groups, SHGs. To, re- to relieve women's SHGs, the government should support industries like the food processing sector and textiles and garments sector. Another sector where women account for the bulk of the workers, which are the main buyers of SHG products. The government of expanding the limit of collateral-free lending to women's self-help groups from rupees 10 lakh to rupees 20 lakhs is another welcome step, but the main problem before SHGs is demand shortages. Special provisions for pregnant and nursing mothers. Government's COVID-19 relief package had no special provisions for pregnant and lactating mothers who are enduring immense hardship during the lockdown. Under the maternity benefit program, pregnant women and lactating mothers already receive a cash transfer of rupees 6,000 in 3 installments. The government could enhance this amount and provide special rations for pregnant and lactating women. Some states like Jharkhand have started a 24/7 maternity or pregnancy helpline to help assess necessary medical assistance during the lockdown. This initiative should be implemented at the national level. So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.